Let me tell you about a season when everyone thought they understood how farming worked. It was the spring of 2012, in the flat, wide country just outside Abilene, Kansas. The kind of place where the sky goes on forever and everybody knows everybody's business, including what you planted and how much you paid for seed. The fields that year looked exactly the way the experts said they should. Rows running straight as rulers. Soil worked down to a fine, clean tilth. New generation hybrid wheat seed going in at the recommended rate. Certified, treated, and backed by 3 different university extension studies. The county AG consultant had been out twice already. A seed company rep had given a presentation at the co-op. Everyone was aligned. Everyone was confident, except for one field. One quiet stretch of acreage on the western edge of the valley, where an old man was planting something that made his neighbors stop their trucks on the road and stare. Something that, by every standard measure, looked completely wrong. That part of central Kansas had been good farming country for 4 generations. Hard red winter wheat was the backbone of it. Planted in the fall in some fields, spring wheat going in on the higher ground. The soil was a dark, loamy silt over clay, the kind that holds moisture well in a wet year and cracks like old pottery in a dry one. 2012 had started with promise. A mild winter, decent snowpack, and commodity prices sitting comfortably above break-even. The futures market had wheat at a level that made the younger farmers in the county feel like they were finally getting somewhere. Several had taken out operating loans to plant more acres, bought new equipment, upgraded their seed selection to the highest performing certified varieties on the market. These were good farmers, smart farmers. They went to the meetings, they read the extension bulletins, they ran the numbers on yield per acre against input costs, and knew their margins better than some people knew their own names. The county's lead agricultural consultant was a man named Davis, mid-40s, fit, drove a clean white pickup, and carried a tablet loaded with soil maps and field analytics. He'd been trained at Kansas State and had the credentials to prove it. When Davis talked, the co-op listened. Davis had identified 3 high-yielding hybrid varieties that season. All 3 were bred for maximum output under optimal conditions. Strong stems, heavy heads, and excellent disease resistance ratings. He'd run the trial data himself. The numbers were clear. Plant the best genetics available, he told farmers at the March meeting. Don't cut corners on your seed. This is the year to go all in. Most of the valley did exactly that. But that's not what made this season different. What nobody noticed at the time was that all those optimized, certified seeds had one thing in common. They'd been bred for performance under ideal conditions. Conditions that, in central Kansas, are never actually guaranteed. The old man's name was Earl Hatch. He was 71 that spring, with hands like dried leather and a face that had been squinting into Kansas wind for 50 years. He drove a 1998 Silverado with a cracked dashboard and a side mirror held on with wire. His barn needed painting. His fences were serviceable, but not impressive. He didn't go to many meetings anymore, not because he didn't care about farming. There was nothing on earth Earl Hatch cared about more. But because he'd found that the meetings had, over the years, started feeling less like conversations and more like sales presentations, and he'd stopped needing to be sold something a long time ago. His farm was 280 acres, same ground his father had broken. He ran it alone, with part-time help at harvest from a neighbor's kid. When the younger farmers talked about Earl, if they talked about him at all, they were respectful enough on the surface. He was old. He'd survived things. That counted for something. But there was always a quiet assumption underneath the politeness, that Earl was behind the times. That his methods were sentiment dressed up as strategy. That he did things the old way because he didn't know the new way. Davis, the consultant, had stopped by Earl's place exactly once, 2 years earlier. Earl had listened carefully, asked a few questions, thanked him, and then done something completely different. Davis hadn't gone back. What made Earl different wasn't stubbornness, it wasn't nostalgia, and it wasn't luck. But you wouldn't know that yet from looking at his field in March of 2012. Earl Hatch had grown up 3 miles from where he still farmed. His father, Roy, had worked that same ground, starting in the late 1940s, coming back from the Pacific with 2 things: a Purple Heart and an unshakable belief that the land would take care of you if you took care of it first. Roy wasn't a romantic about farming, he was precise, all patient, and deeply skeptical of anything that promised results without explaining the mechanism. He'd taught Earl to read soil the way other fathers taught their sons to read box scores, not just pH and NPK levels, but texture and color and the way water moved through it after a hard rain. He'd taught him to watch the wild plants, the weeds, the native grasses, because they told you things about a field that no soil test could. And he'd taught him one principle that Earl had never once found reason to abandon in 50 years of farming. The seed that performs best in a good year, Roy had told him, standing in a stubble field one October when Earl was about 16, is not always the seed that survives a bad one. And out here, Earl, you will always eventually get a bad one. That was it. That was the core of it. Not maximizing yield in optimal conditions, not chasing the highest number in the trial data, but understanding that farming is not a single season. It's a continuous negotiation with conditions you cannot fully control, and the farmer who plans only for the best case is building on sand. Earl had spent decades acting on that principle. He kept records, handwritten, in ledgers stacked in his office, going back to 1974. Not just his yields, but his input costs, his seed sources, the weather patterns, the disease pressures, the years when everything went right, and the years when everything went sideways. Those records had taught him something the trial data didn't capture. The varieties that consistently produced across bad years and good years weren't always the flashiest performers. They were the ones with deep root development, stress tolerance, and genetic diversity. The ones that were, by modern commercial standards, a little old-fashioned. And in the spring of 2012, Earl Hatch drove to a small seed operation in western Nebraska and came back with something nobody else in the county was planting. Word got around the way it always does in a small farming county. Somebody saw the seed bags in the back of Earl's truck at the grain elevator. Somebody else asked a question. By the time the planting week was over, Davis had heard about it. The seed Earl was using was an open-pollinated heritage wheat variety, not a certified hybrid, not a university-recommended selection. It had been maintained by a small seed-saving operation for 30 years. Its yield data, in controlled trials, was modest compared to the modern hybrids. Its appearance, frankly, was unremarkable. To anyone trained in contemporary agronomy, the choice looked like a mistake. Davis mentioned it at the next co-op gathering, not cruelly, but with the particular confidence of someone who has the data on his side. Earl Hatch is putting in heritage open pole wheat, he said. Could be sentimental, could be he got a good price. He paused just long enough to let the room do the math. Either way, I wouldn't expect his numbers to challenge anybody's this fall. There was laughter. Not mean laughter exactly. Just the comfortable laughter of people who believe they understand the situation. One of the younger farmers, a sharp operator named Greg, who had planted the full recommended hybrid rate on 600 acres, summed it up the way the room was feeling. Those seeds are basically dead weight, he said. You want genetics working for you. That old stuff just isn't built for what we need. Earl wasn't there to hear it. He was home, planting. In late April, Davis organized a field walk, a casual tour of several operations in the valley, the kind of event where farmers compare notes and consultants reinforce their recommendations. The group ended up near Earl's field late in the afternoon, more by geographic proximity than intention. The contrast was visible immediately, and not in Earl's favor. The neighboring fields showed the clean, even emergence you expect from high-quality certified seed. Uniform green rows, strong early stands, exactly what the trial data promised. Earl's field was thinner in places, less uniform. The early growth looked, to a trained eye, a bit ragged. Someone made a comment. There were nods. May Davis was measured but clear. Heritage varieties often show inconsistent emergence. That's part of why the industry moved away from them. You lose control of uniformity. Earl stood at the edge of his own field, a few yards from the group, and said nothing. He wasn't wounded by it. He wasn't performing patience. He had simply been here before, not this exact moment, but this shape of moment. And he had learned long ago that the early stages of a growing season tell you only part of the story. He looked at his field the way his father had taught him to look at it, not at the surface, at what was underneath. And then he walked back to his truck and drove home. May came in well, good rains, mild temperatures. The certified hybrid fields in the valley looked outstanding, dense, green, Oh, the kind of growth that makes a farmer exhale and start doing mental math on yield estimates. Earl's field continued to look unspectacular by comparison. A bit thinner, a bit less even. A few people drove past and looked. A few conversations were had. The general consensus solidified. Earl was going to have a disappointing year. Maybe not a catastrophic one, but a below-average one. The kind of year that politely confirms what the data already said. Davis ran the numbers one afternoon and put together a rough projection. The hybrid fields, if conditions held, were looking at strong yields, potentially a top 5 season for the valley. Earl's projected numbers were modest. Not a disaster, but not competitive. Everything the experts believed appeared to be correct. And that's when things started to change. June came in dry. Not unusual for Kansas, but this was different. The National Weather Service had been tracking a high-pressure ridge that had locked itself over the Central Plains and showed no intention of moving. By the second week of June, rainfall was tracking 40% below normal. By the third week, the topsoil moisture maps were flashing yellow across the county. The certified hybrid varieties had been bred for performance. What that meant, specifically, was that they'd been optimized for yield under adequate moisture conditions. They had strong tops, heavy stems, large grain heads, and root systems designed to feed that top-end growth efficiently when water was available. When water wasn't available, those root systems had a problem. The hybrids began showing stress by late June. In leaf rolling first, the plant's mechanism for reducing moisture loss, then discoloration, then the particular gray-green pallor that farmers in the plains know means the crop is moving from stress into survival mode. Greg's 600-acre operation was hit hard. He'd planted on the lighter, sandier ground at the south end of his property, and that's where the stress showed first. Whole sections of what had been lush green growth turning dull and tight. The grain heads beginning to set early under duress, which meant smaller kernels and sharply reduced yield. Davis was on the phone constantly. There was nothing to do but manage the stress as best they could and hope the ridge broke. But Earl's field was doing something unexpected. You had to stand at the edge of both fields to really understand what was happening. On one side of the road, in the certified hybrid wheat, still technically alive, still technically a crop, but clearly compromised. The stands were thin where the stress had hit hardest. The color was wrong. The heads were small and set unevenly. On the other side, Earl's heritage open-pollinated wheat was doing something the experts hadn't projected. It was growing. Not dramatically, not explosively, but steadily, quietly, with a kind of unhurried confidence that made you stop and look twice. The stands were denser than they'd appeared in May. The roots on that variety, deeper running by genetic nature, bred across decades of exactly this kind of variable plains weather, had found moisture 2 feet down that the shallower hybrid roots hadn't reached. The plants were shorter than the hybrids would have been at full development, but they were upright. The heads were filling. The color was a rich, deep green gold, the color wheat turns when it's healthy and moving toward maturity with full nutrition behind it. Davis drove out on a Thursday afternoon in early July and parked on the road between the two fields for a long time without getting out of his truck. The yield gap that had been projected, with Earl trailing, had inverted. When the combines ran in late July, the numbers made the valley quiet. Earl's heritage wheat came in at 54 bushels per acre. Not a record, but a solid, strong yield for a drought-stressed year. The high-performance hybrid fields on comparable ground averaged 31. Greg's worst sections came in under 20. The old man's field had outproduced the experts' farms by nearly double. There's a specific kind of silence that settles over a farming community when something contradicts everything it believed. It's not the silence of embarrassment exactly. It's more like the silence of recalibration, the quiet of people doing rapid private accounting, not of money, but of assumptions. Davis didn't post his yield projections on the co-op board that year. He didn't run the comparison numbers publicly. At the August meeting, the room was subdued. Greg said very little. He was doing the math on his operating loan. The drought year had hurt him badly. Not ruinously, but enough to sting, enough to make him think. And everyone in that room was thinking the same thing, though nobody was quite ready to say it out loud. How did the old man know? Davis drove out to Earl's place in August, just after harvest. Maney sat across from Earl at a kitchen table that had probably had 4 generations of farmers' elbows on it, and he asked the question directly. How did you know this year was going to be a drought year? Earl looked at him steadily. I didn't, he said. Davis waited. I never know what the year's going to be. Nobody does, not really. You can read the forecasts, you can check the soil moisture, you can do everything right and still get a year that goes sideways. He turned his coffee cup slowly on the table. The question I stopped asking a long time ago was, what's going to maximize my yield if everything goes well? The question I started asking instead was, what's going to keep me farming if everything goes wrong? Davis looked at him. And that changes what you plant. That changes everything, Earl said. It's a principle that sounds simple until you really sit with it. Most farmers plant what looks strong. They choose the seed with the best trial data, the highest projected yield, the strongest performance under ideal conditions. And in a good year, that strategy works. It works very well. But farming is not a single good year. It's a sequence of years that includes droughts and floods and disease pressure and late frosts and all the things that don't show up in the optimistic projections. And the operation that survives, not just for one season, but across decades, is the one that has built resilience into its foundation. Earl said it the way his father had said it to him. Most farmers plant what looks strong. I plant what survives when things go wrong. Not because he'd given up on performance. His yields in good years were respectable, but because he understood, at a level that went deeper than any spreadsheet, that the true measure of a farming system is not what it produces when conditions cooperate. It's what it produces when they don't. Earl Hatch farmed that ground for 8 more years after the drought season of 2012. He never became famous. He never wrote a book or gave a keynote at a conference. His barn still needed painting. He never did fix that side mirror. But something changed in the valley after that year. Quietly, gradually, the way most real changes happen. Davis began asking different questions at his consultations. Not just, what variety performs best in trials, but what does the risk profile look like if conditions underperform? He started recommending that farmers diversify their seed selection. Yes, build in some genetic variety rather than going all in on a single high-performance hybrid. Greg, to his credit, came and asked Earl directly if he'd be willing to sell him seed stock. Earl thought about it for a week and then said yes, at cost. A few younger farmers started showing up at Earl's kitchen table over those years, not for formal consultations, but for conversation. Earl wasn't a teacher by profession or inclination, but he had those ledgers, and he'd let you look through them if you asked the right way. And what you'd find in there was something no extension bulletin could quite replicate. 50 years of real decisions, made under real pressure, with real consequences, and what had actually worked across all of it, not in the best years, across all of it. Before Earl retired from full-time farming at 79, he did one thing he hadn't planned on. He wrote down, in a simple document that ran to about 4 pages, the principles he'd farmed by his whole life. Not techniques exactly, more like questions he'd trained himself to ask. He gave copies to 6 farmers in the valley who he thought would do something with them. The front page had a single line, handwritten, before the typed text began. The land doesn't care about your projections. It only cares about your preparation. That's the thing about wisdom earned through decades of dirt and weather and hard seasons. It doesn't make for flashy presentations. It doesn't travel well in slide decks. But when the dry years come, and they always come, you find out very quickly who's been paying attention, and the old man who plants what survives is still farming. While everyone else is making calls to the bank,